Welcome back to the channel, where history's darkest mysteries and the world's most unsettling stories are brought back to life. Today we begin a journey into one of the most infamous cases in Russia's modern history, a case that would haunt investigators, terrify entire communities, and reveal shocking flaws in a justice system that struggled to keep up with the truth. But before we dive into the terrifying details, let us start at the very beginning, with the life of a boy who seemed ordinary, yet grew up in circumstances that were far from normal. Andrei Chikatilo was born in 1936 in a small village in Soviet Ukraine during a time of extraordinary hardship. His early childhood unfolded against the backdrop of the Holodomor, a devastating famine that claimed millions of lives. Families starved, neighbors disappeared, and children were often left malnourished and emotionally scarred. In this grim world, survival was not guaranteed, and the trauma of those years would linger in ways no one could have predicted. His parents were poor peasants, struggling daily just to put food on the table. Stories from his childhood speak of hunger so severe that it shaped the very identity of entire generations. His father was later conscripted into the Red Army during World War II, leaving the family even more vulnerable. Meanwhile, his mother, overwhelmed by poverty and constant fear, was left to raise him and his sister under extremely harsh conditions. It was a childhood marked not by play or innocence, but by loss, insecurity, and fear. Neighbors recalled how quiet and withdrawn he was. Unlike other children who sought companionship, he often kept to himself, building a world of silence around his own pain. There were whispers that his older brother may have been kidnapped during the famine, a rumor that haunted him deeply, though it was never fully confirmed. Such stories, whether true or not, added another layer of fear to a boy already growing up in a world of shadows. On the surface, Andrei's childhood may not have seemed drastically different from many others who endured the same hardships. Yet what made his story distinct was how these experiences interacted with his fragile personality. Hunger, humiliation, and social isolation carved deep wounds. At school, he was bullied and humiliated, mocked for his shyness and for his physical insecurities. His inability to fit in or form healthy relationships only deepened his loneliness. As we look back now, these early years provide chilling clues to the man he would one day become. A boy who was born into famine, raised in fear, and shaped by humiliation, would later channel that brokenness into acts that shocked the world. But in the beginning, he was just a child in a poor Ukrainian village, one among millions struggling to survive. The question that history still wrestles with is this: was he shaped by his environment, or was there something darker always present inside him? This is where our story begins, in poverty, in hunger, and in silence. As Andrei Chikatilo grew older, the hardships of his childhood began to leave visible marks, not only on his body, but also on his mind. While many children of the post-war Soviet Union shared the struggle of poverty, Andrei's difficulties went deeper, shaping his sense of identity and fueling an inner conflict that would stay with him for life. From a young age, he suffered from physical weaknesses that set him apart from others. He was frail, often ill, and visibly smaller than the boys around him. This physical vulnerability made him a target for ridicule at school, where classmates mocked his awkwardness and shy demeanor. Instead of fighting back, Andrei withdrew further into himself, becoming quiet and secretive. Teachers described him as intelligent but nervous, a boy who avoided attention rather than sought it. Behind this exterior of silence, however, lay a storm of insecurity. One of the most defining aspects of his adolescence was his struggle with sexual impotence. For a boy already shy and isolated, this condition was deeply humiliating, particularly in a society where masculinity was often equated with strength and dominance. Unable to form healthy romantic relationships, he retreated into a world of fantasy and private shame. Each rejection, each failed attempt at intimacy, widened the gap between him and the rest of the world. His family life offered little comfort. His mother was known to be strict, demanding obedience and discipline from her children. While this was common in Soviet households of the time, for Andrei it reinforced feelings of inadequacy. His father, who returned from the war as a prisoner of the Germans, carried his own scars of trauma and provided little emotional support. This lack of warmth at home, combined with his struggles outside, left Andrei with few places where he felt secure or valued. To cope, he buried himself in academics. Books became his refuge. He read voraciously, excelling in literature and history, and even dreamed of becoming a journalist or a writer. For a time, this ambition gave him purpose, something to hold on to, in a world that often felt hostile. Yet, when he eventually failed his entrance exams to university, the rejection was devastating. It was another reminder that no matter how hard he tried, the world seemed determined to push him aside. By his late teens and early 20s, these patterns of failure and frustration had hardened into resentment. He longed for respect, but instead he was seen as weak. He yearned for intimacy, but faced rejection. These unfulfilled desires festered, turning into a source of bitterness that he carried in silence. Outwardly, he remained quiet, polite, even unremarkable. Inwardly, however, the cracks in his character were widening. Looking back, it is tempting to see these struggles as warning signs, but at the time no one could have predicted what they might lead to. Many young men faced similar hardships in post-war Soviet society, yet most never crossed the line into violence. Andrei Chikatilo's story raises the haunting question: what combination of personal pain and hidden impulses transforms an ordinary life into something extraordinary and terrifying? As Andrei Chikatilo moved into adulthood, he began to construct the outward image of a man who lived an entirely ordinary life. To the people around him, he was not a figure of suspicion or fear, but rather someone who blended into the background of Soviet society, a husband, a father, and an employee, doing his part in a country that valued conformity above all else. Despite his inner struggles, he managed to marry a woman named Feodosia in the early 1970s. The marriage was arranged with the encouragement of his sister, who was concerned about his inability to find a partner on his own. To outsiders, it seemed like a positive step, a quiet, shy man who had finally settled down to start a family. Remarkably, the couple went on to have 2 children, a boy and a girl. This created the perfect illusion of normality. To neighbors and colleagues, Chikatilo was simply a family man, strict, reserved, but otherwise unremarkable. In terms of career, he held a series of jobs that further solidified this image. He first worked as a school teacher, a role that gave him authority and status in the community. Though some students found him strange or overly strict, few could have imagined the darkness that lay beneath his quiet demeanor. Later, when he left teaching, he found steady employment at a factory, and later as a clerk. These roles, though uninspiring, allowed him to live a life free from suspicion, while also giving him access to the anonymity of Soviet urban life, where people rarely questioned their co-workers' private affairs. At home, his personality was shaped by contradictions. On one hand, he was known to be disciplined and serious, rarely showing warmth. On the other, he could be attentive to his children, ensuring they were fed, clothed, and educated. To his wife, he was a distant but dutiful partner, a man who provided stability if not affection. This careful balance allowed him to hide his insecurities behind the mask of a responsible adult. What made Chikatilo's double life so effective was how completely ordinary he appeared. Unlike the sensationalized image of criminals who stand out as rebels or outcasts, he worked hard to blend in. He dressed conservatively, lived modestly, and avoided drawing attention to himself. To the authorities, he was not someone who would ever raise alarms. He looked like countless other Soviet men, tired from long workdays, committed to family, obedient to the rules of society. But beneath that surface, the same frustrations that had plagued him since youth never disappeared. His personal failures, his inability to experience intimacy in a fulfilling way, and his simmering resentment toward the world remained hidden, festering behind closed doors. While his family life and career gave the impression of normality, they did nothing to resolve the storm within. This contrast between appearance and reality is one of the most chilling aspects of his story. Here was a man who sat at the dinner table with his children, commuted to work like everyone else, and exchanged polite greetings with neighbors. Yet he carried secrets that no one around him could even imagine. The mask of normalcy was not just effective, it was almost perfect. And that mask would allow him to move undetected for years, even as his hidden impulses grew stronger. The mask of normalcy that Andrei Chikatilo so carefully maintained began to crack in 1978. That year marked a turning point in his life, the moment when his hidden impulses crossed into the real world, setting off a series of crimes that would continue for more than a decade. His first known victim was a 9-year-old girl named Yelena Zakotnova, and the story of her disappearance and death would later be recognized as the chilling beginning of one of the darkest chapters in Soviet criminal history. Chikatilo lured Yelena by offering to show her a shortcut near a riverbank close to his home in the Rostov region. To those who might have seen them walking together, it may have seemed like nothing unusual, a quiet man helping a child. But in reality, he had led her into an isolated area where there were no witnesses, no interruptions, and no chance of rescue. What followed was the first expression of his violent urges, an act that left investigators baffled and the community shaken. At the time, the Soviet Union rarely publicized crimes of this nature. Local police, pressured to maintain the image of a safe and orderly society, initially mishandled the investigation. A local man, innocent of the crime, was arrested, convicted, and eventually executed for Yelena's murder. Meanwhile, the real killer Chikatilo remained free. This tragic miscarriage of justice not only allowed him to escape suspicion, but also emboldened him. He had learned an important and dangerous lesson, that he could commit the unthinkable and walk away without consequence. In the years that followed, the memory of his first crime would haunt him, but it would also fuel him. For someone who had lived much of his life feeling powerless, isolated, and humiliated, this moment gave him a twisted sense of control. It was the start of a pattern that would repeat again and again, selecting vulnerable victims, luring them into seclusion and silencing them forever. What makes this first murder especially chilling in retrospect is how ordinary Chikatilo's life appeared immediately afterward. He returned to his job, went home to his wife and children, and continued to present himself as a quiet, disciplined man. No one in his family suspected a thing. Neighbors continued to greet him politely. Colleagues went about their work without any idea of the secret he was hiding. To the world, nothing had changed. But for Chikatilo, everything had. The death of Yelena Zakotnova marked the beginning of a spree that would stretch across 12 years, claiming more than 50 lives. And it all started with that single moment in 1978, when the facade of an ordinary man slipped away to reveal something far more sinister. After his first crime in 1978, Andrei Chikatilo began to refine the way he operated. Over the years, investigators would come to recognize a disturbing pattern in his methods, one that made him both terrifyingly effective and incredibly difficult to stop. His crimes were not random bursts of violence, but carefully staged encounters that followed a chilling routine. Chikatilo's choice of location was one of the most crucial aspects of his strategy. He often selected remote areas near forests, train stations, or riverbanks, places where he could isolate his victims quickly and avoid being noticed. Soviet infrastructure at the time made this even easier. Many towns were surrounded by wooded areas or abandoned lots where people rarely ventured. These settings allowed him to commit his crimes without interruption and slip back into daily life without leaving obvious traces. His victims were carefully chosen. He rarely targeted those who might be missed immediately by powerful families or influential authorities. Instead, he preyed on the vulnerable young children, teenagers, runaways, and women traveling alone. These individuals were easier to lure with simple promises, food, a place to rest, or even small gifts. Some victims were persuaded with the suggestion of a shortcut or an offer of companionship. His calm, almost fatherly appearance made him seem trustworthy. To the unsuspecting, he was just another quiet man willing to help. Once he gained their trust, Chikatilo would lead them into secluded areas. There, his behavior changed abruptly. The reserved, polite exterior gave way to uncontrollable violence. He often carried a knife, and his attacks were characterized by frenzied stabbing. For investigators, the sheer brutality of these assaults was shocking, with many victims suffering dozens of wounds. This excessive violence was not simply a means to kill. It revealed the depth of his inner rage and the personal release he seemed to find in these acts. Another disturbing aspect of his modus operandi was his ability to return to normalcy almost immediately afterward. He would often leave the crime scene, clean himself up, and rejoin everyday life as though nothing had happened. Sometimes, he even returned to his family directly after an attack, eating dinner at the same table with his wife and children. This ability to compartmentalize, to switch between the mask of a quiet family man and the reality of a predator, allowed him to remain undetected for years. As investigators would later learn, Chikatilo adapted his methods over time. He paid attention to what allowed him to escape detection and became increasingly skilled at avoiding suspicion. While his violence remained shockingly consistent, his ability to hide in plain sight improved with each crime. Looking back, it is clear that his modus operandi was not just about opportunity, but also about control. He selected the weak, isolated them, and destroyed them in ways that reflected both his frustrations and his desire to dominate. This terrifying routine would become the blueprint for one of the most prolific killing sprees in history. To truly understand the scale of Andrei Chikatilo's crimes, one must look closely at the people he targeted. His victims were not chosen at random. There was a disturbing logic to the way he selected them, one that reveals both his calculated planning and his predatory instincts. The profiles of those he attacked paint a tragic picture of vulnerability, trust, and exploitation. Chikatilo preyed primarily on women and children. Many of his victims were teenagers, both boys and girls, who were easy to lure with promises of food, shelter, or guidance. In the collapsing Soviet landscape of the late 1970s and 1980s, runaway youths were a common sight, especially around train stations. These stations, bustling with travelers and filled with young people escaping difficult home lives, provided him with a constant supply of potential targets. He knew that many of them were desperate, hungry, and alone, making them more likely to trust a stranger who appeared kind and willing to help. Women, traveling by themselves, also became frequent victims. Some were students, others were workers on their way home, and many were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Chikatilo's demeanor, quiet, serious, and seemingly harmless, made him appear trustworthy. He was not the kind of man who stood out in a crowd or raised immediate suspicion. To women walking alone, he might have seemed like a safe presence in a world where danger was not always obvious. Another factor in his victim selection was the lack of immediate accountability. Many of the people he targeted came from marginalized or impoverished backgrounds. If they disappeared, it could take days or even weeks before anyone reported them missing. In some cases, families assumed their children had run away, while authorities often dismissed disappearances as voluntary. This delay worked in Chikatilo's favor, giving him time to cover his tracks and distance himself from the crime scenes. The diversity of his victims also confused investigators. Unlike some killers who follow a narrow pattern, Chikatilo's victims spanned a wide range of ages, from young children as young as 7 to adults in their 40s. Both males and females fell prey to him. This lack of a single, clear profile made it difficult for authorities to connect the crimes. At first, investigators even questioned whether the murders could be linked at all. since the victims seemed so different. Only later did they realize that the true common thread was not in who they were, but in their vulnerability and isolation at the moment Chikatilo approached them. For the communities affected, the fear was overwhelming. Parents were terrified to let their children out of sight. Women avoided traveling alone. Rumors spread quickly across villages and towns, yet no one could identify the man responsible. He was a predator hiding in plain sight, using the trust of the innocent as his greatest weapon. In the end, the profiles of his victims highlight the tragedy of his crimes. They were not powerful figures or high-profile targets. They were ordinary people, caught in moments of weakness, whose trust was betrayed in the most horrifying way possible. As the years passed, the number of Andrei Chikatilo's victims began to climb at a pace that stunned investigators once the full extent of his crimes was finally uncovered. Between 1978 and 1990, he is believed to have murdered at least 52 people, though some experts suggest the true number could be higher. This staggering figure places him among the most prolific serial killers of the 20th century, and the scale of his violence left entire regions of the Soviet Union gripped with fear. The murders were not clustered in a single burst of activity, but spread out over more than a decade. This long timeline allowed Chikatilo to refine his methods while also avoiding detection. Each case on its own seemed horrific enough, but when investigators later pieced them together, the scope was overwhelming, a pattern of destruction that claimed dozens of innocent lives and haunted countless families. The variety of his victims also contributed to the shocking scale of the crimes. Unlike killers who focus on a single demographic, Chikatilo's targets ranged widely in age and background. Some were very young children, others were teenagers full of life, and still others were adult women traveling alone. The randomness of these choices amplified the terror. People could not predict who might be next, because there was no single profile to fit. The message to the community was chillingly simple. No one was safe. What made the situation even worse was the failure of the authorities to connect the dots early on. For years, individual murders were treated as isolated incidents rather than part of a larger pattern. This delay in recognizing the truth allowed Chikatilo to continue without serious interruption, adding to his victim count. By the time police began to suspect that a single killer was responsible, the death toll had already reached horrifying numbers. Families who lost loved ones were left in despair. In many cases, they had to wait years for answers, enduring rumors and uncertainty while the killings continued. The grief was magnified by the secrecy surrounding such crimes in the Soviet Union. Newspapers rarely reported details, as officials feared widespread panic and damage to the image of public safety. As a result, many families felt isolated in their loss, unaware that dozens of others were suffering the same nightmare. When the final tally of victims was presented in court during Chikatilo's trial, it shocked not only the public but also the global community. The idea that one man could take so many lives over such a long period, in a modern state with police and surveillance, seemed almost unimaginable. It revealed both the depth of his cruelty and the staggering failure of the system meant to stop him. In the end, the number more than 50 confirmed deaths was not just a statistic. Each life represented a child, a teenager, or a parent whose future was stolen. Together, these lives formed a tragic ledger of loss, a reminder of how one man's hidden darkness can devastate entire communities when it goes unchecked. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Chikatilo case was not only the brutality of his crimes, but also the way the Soviet justice system failed to stop him. In fact, the investigation itself became a tragedy within the tragedy, marked by errors, false arrests, and even the execution of innocent men. These failures allowed Chikatilo to continue his spree for more than a decade, leaving a trail of victims that might have been prevented. At the time, the Soviet Union was a society deeply invested in projecting an image of order and control. Violent crime, especially crimes of such brutality, did not fit the official narrative of a disciplined, safe socialist state. As a result, police were under immense pressure to solve cases quickly and present results to higher authorities. When faced with a gruesome murder, investigators were expected to identify a culprit, any culprit, rather than admit that they could not find the real one. This pressure led to tragic consequences. Several men were wrongly accused of murders actually committed by Chikatilo. In some cases, suspects confessed under duress or after harsh interrogations. Others were convicted on flimsy evidence because investigators were desperate to close cases. Shockingly, at least one innocent man was executed for a crime he did not commit. This miscarriage of justice not only destroyed lives, but also removed any sense of accountability from the real killer, who continued his crimes undetected. The investigative methods of the time also revealed serious shortcomings. Forensic science in the Soviet Union lagged behind Western practices. DNA testing was not available, and crime scenes were often contaminated or poorly documented. Witnesses were unreliable, especially since many victims were children or runaways who had last been seen near train stations or markets, crowded places where people barely noticed strangers. Without solid evidence, investigators leaned heavily on forced confessions, which only deepened the problem. Another critical failure was the inability to recognize a pattern. Because Chikatilo's victims varied in age and gender, many officials resisted the idea that one man could be responsible for so many different cases. Some investigators even dismissed the possibility of a serial killer altogether, claiming such a phenomenon was a Western problem and not something that could exist in the Soviet Union. This denial delayed the realization that a predator was operating across the Rostov region, costing more lives. For the families of victims, the failures of the system were devastating. Not only did they lose loved ones, but they also had to endure the knowledge that innocent men were punished while the real killer remained free. For communities, this eroded trust in law enforcement and fueled widespread fear. When Chikatilo was finally arrested years later, the truth about these investigative errors came to light. The case became a harsh lesson in how systemic denial, political pressure, and flawed methods can combine to protect the very person they are meant to capture. In many ways, the failures of the investigation are as infamous as the crimes themselves, serving as a grim reminder of how justice, when misdirected, can deepen tragedy rather than end it. By the late 1980s, the Soviet police could no longer deny the truth. The mounting number of murders, the similarities in the brutality, and the growing public fear made it impossible to dismiss the idea that a single killer was responsible. After years of false arrests and tragic mistakes, investigators finally began to piece together the pattern. The turning point came in 1990, when careful surveillance and persistence brought the long hunt for Andrei Chikatilo to an end. The breakthrough was the result of a more modernized investigative effort. By this time, a new team of detectives had been assigned to the case, many of them younger and more open to ideas that had once been dismissed. They began to treat the murders as connected and adopted techniques that were closer to Western criminal profiling. They studied the killer's habits, his choice of locations, the type of victims he lured, and the violent nature of the attacks. Slowly, a picture emerged of a man who blended into society but returned again and again to train stations and wooded areas. Surveillance became the key strategy. Officers were dispatched to monitor train stations, bus depots, and markets, the very places where Chikatilo often found his victims. In November 1990, during one of these stakeouts near a station in Rostov, investigators noticed a familiar figure. A man in a long coat was loitering around the platforms, approaching young people with offers of help or conversation. His behavior was suspicious but subtle, the kind of thing that might go unnoticed to most. To the trained eyes of the surveillance team, however, it stood out. That man was Andrei Chikatilo. When officers confronted him, they found he was carrying a briefcase filled with items that raised immediate concern: rope, a knife, and other objects that had no innocent explanation. Although this was not yet enough to secure a conviction, it provided the grounds to bring him in for questioning. At first, Chikatilo denied everything, presenting himself as a harmless man unfairly targeted by the police. For a time, his calm, almost academic demeanor made some investigators doubt they had the right person. But as they dug deeper, the evidence began to mount. Blood samples, eyewitness accounts, and his suspicious behavior at train stations all pointed in one direction. After days of interrogation, the pressure finally broke him. Chikatilo confessed, not just to one crime but to dozens. In chilling detail, he described how he had selected, lured, and killed his victims over the span of more than a decade. The arrest of Andrei Chikatilo in 1990 was a moment of relief for a nation that had lived in fear for years. Parents could finally let their children walk to school without the same dread. Communities could begin to grieve and heal, knowing the predator who had haunted them was behind bars. Yet the arrest also reopened old wounds, reminding everyone of the innocent men who had been wrongly punished while the true killer walked free. Still, for investigators, this moment was both a triumph and a tragedy. They had finally stopped the Butcher of Rostov, but only after more than 50 lives had already been lost. Once Andrei Chikatilo was finally in custody, the facade he had maintained for over a decade began to crumble. For years he had lived a double life, the quiet family man by day, the ruthless predator by night. But under the relentless pressure of interrogation, his carefully constructed mask slipped away. What emerged was a confession so extensive, so horrifying, that it stunned even the most hardened investigators. At first, Chikatilo denied any involvement. He insisted he was being framed, that the police were desperate to pin unsolved crimes on him. His calm and intellectual demeanor gave weight to his words. He quoted literature, spoke in a measured tone, and tried to present himself as a victim of circumstance. But investigators had learned their lesson from past mistakes. This time they had evidence, surveillance reports, and forensic samples to support their suspicions. Faced with mounting proof, Chikatilo's defenses began to falter. Over the course of several days, cracks appeared in his story. Eventually he broke down and confessed not just to a single murder, but to a staggering number of crimes that stretched back more than a decade. In shocking detail, he admitted to killing more than 50 people, recounting the circumstances of each attack with chilling precision. Investigators listened in disbelief as he described how he selected his victims, vulnerable children, lonely teenagers, women traveling alone. He explained how he lured them with promises of help, food, or small gifts, leading them into secluded areas where he unleashed his hidden rage. His confessions matched crime scene details that only the killer could have known: the number of stab wounds, the locations of attacks, the way certain bodies were left behind. What struck detectives most was the clinical manner in which he spoke. There was no visible remorse, no sign of empathy for the lives he had taken. Instead, he described his actions as though he were recounting events from a book or a lesson. For many officers present, it was the first time they had witnessed someone articulate such horrific acts with such detachment. His confession did more than confirm his guilt. It revealed the full scope of his crimes. Many cases that had remained unsolved for years were now explained. Families who had long lived without answers finally learned the fate of their loved ones, even if the truth was more painful than they could have imagined. The official tally reached at least 52 murders, making Chikatilo one of the most prolific killers in modern history. The confession also forced the Soviet authorities to confront their earlier failures. The innocent men who had been wrongly arrested or executed were now undeniable proof of the system's flaws. Chikatilo himself pointed out that he had been arrested once before and released, a mistake that allowed him to continue killing. For the investigators who had dedicated years of their lives to the case, hearing the full truth was both a victory and a nightmare. They had finally unmasked the Butcher of Rostov, but the sheer magnitude of his crimes left them shaken. His words, cold and matter-of-fact, would haunt them for years to come. By the early 1990s, the story of Andrei Chikatilo had grown too large, too shocking, to be contained within the usual walls of secrecy in the Soviet system. His arrest in 1990 and his chilling confession forced the state to take his case to trial. What followed between 1992 and 1994 was one of the most sensational trials in Russian history, a courtroom spectacle that horrified the public, embarrassed the authorities, and revealed the darkest corners of human cruelty. The trial began in April 1992 in Rostov-on-Don, and from the very start it drew enormous attention. Hundreds of journalists, family members of victims, and curious citizens filled the courtroom each day. For many, this was the first time they had ever witnessed such proceedings openly discussed, as Soviet-era secrecy around violent crime had begun to crumble with the fall of the USSR. The crimes of the Butcher of Rostov became national news, and the trial became a grim stage where justice and horror collided. Chikatilo himself seemed almost to relish the spotlight. When he was brought into the courtroom, he was placed inside a large steel cage, a measure intended both for security and for symbolism. To many observers, it was as if the state was putting a monster on display. His behavior shocked onlookers. At times, he ranted incoherently, shouting at judges and prosecutors. At other moments, he remained eerily calm, speaking about his crimes with chilling detachment. He even stripped naked during parts of the trial, further unsettling everyone present. These theatrics raised questions about his mental state, but psychiatric evaluations declared him sane and fit to stand trial. The evidence presented was overwhelming. His detailed confessions matched crime scene reports, forensic evidence, and witness testimonies. Investigators testified about his patterns, the surveillance that led to his arrest, and the items found in his possession. Families of victims were called to the stand, their grief filling the courtroom with raw emotion. Mothers and fathers wept openly as they recounted the last time they had seen their children alive. The sheer number of cases linked to him, over 50 murders, left the courtroom in stunned silence on more than one occasion. The defense attempted to argue insanity, claiming that no sane man could commit such atrocities. But the prosecution insisted otherwise. Chikatilo was not insane, they argued, but methodical, deliberate, and entirely responsible for his actions. After months of testimony and weeks of deliberation, the verdict was clear. In October 1992, the court found him guilty of 52 murders and sentenced him to death. For the families of victims, the sentence brought a measure of closure, though nothing could truly compensate for their loss. For Russia, the trial was a turning point, a moment when the full scale of systemic failures was laid bare in public view. And for Chikatilo, it was the end of his long, double life. He would remain on death row for nearly 2 years, appealing his sentence but never escaping the inevitable. In 1994, the final chapter of his story would be written, not in a courtroom, but in a prison cell, as the state carried out his execution. In February 1994, after years of investigation, confession, and a trial that had shocked the nation, the story of Andrei Chikatilo reached its inevitable end. The man who had once lived behind the mask of a quiet family man, who had preyed on the vulnerable for more than a decade, and who had come to be known as the Butcher of Rostov, was finally executed. His death marked the close of one of the darkest chapters in Russian criminal history. Following his conviction in 1992, Chikatilo was sent to death row at Novocherkassk prison. There, he spent nearly 2 years in solitary confinement. His appeals were rejected one after another, and the Supreme Court upheld the death sentence. Throughout this period, reports suggest that he alternated between moments of resignation and bursts of agitation. At times, he was calm and detached, much as he had been during his interrogations. At other times, he displayed the same erratic behavior that had unsettled observers during his trial. For the families of his victims, those 2 years were filled with both relief and frustration. Relief that he could no longer harm anyone, but frustration that justice seemed to move slowly. They wanted closure, a final confirmation that the man responsible for so much grief would never again walk free. Each delay felt like an extension of their suffering. Finally, on February 14, 1994, the sentence was carried out. Chikatilo was led from his cell to a small room within the prison. There was no spectacle, no final public display. In stark contrast to the chaos and theatrics of his trial, his death was swift and quiet. He was executed by a single gunshot to the head, the standard method of capital punishment in Russia at the time. With that act, the state brought an end to the life of one of its most notorious killers. News of his execution spread quickly. For some, it was a moment of grim satisfaction, a sense that justice had finally been served. For others, it was a reminder of the countless lives lost and the years of fear that had gripped entire communities. In many ways, his death brought more reflection than relief. The questions his case raised about the failures of the justice system, the secrecy of the Soviet state, and the nature of evil itself did not disappear with him. Today, the legacy of Andrei Chikatilo remains a chilling lesson. He is remembered not only for the unimaginable scale of his crimes, but also for the systemic failures that allowed him to continue for so long. His execution closed the story of his life, but the memory of his victims and the scars left on their families endure. The Butcher of Rostov was gone, but the lessons of his case continue to echo a reminder of the dangers hidden behind ordinary faces and of the importance of vigilance, accountability, and truth in the pursuit of justice. As we reach the end of this story, one thing becomes clear. The case of Andrei Chikatilo was more than just the crimes of one man. It was a tragedy that stretched across entire communities, devastating families, and leaving scars that can never fully heal. It revealed how a predator could hide in plain sight for years, and how the failures of a justice system allowed him to continue long after he should have been stopped. The legacy of the Butcher of Rostov is not only measured by the more than 50 lives he stole, but also by the lessons his case left behind. It forced investigators, policymakers, and ordinary citizens to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the dangers of silence, and about the cost of ignoring warning signs. His crime showed how evil can sometimes wear the face of the ordinary, a quiet man, a husband, a father, and how appearances can conceal unimaginable darkness. Yet in telling this story, we also remember the victims. They were children, teenagers, and women who deserved safety, joy, and futures that were stolen from them. Their lives should not be forgotten, and in revisiting this history, we honor their memory by refusing to let their suffering fade into silence. The execution of Chikatilo in 1994 ended his personal chapter, but the questions his life and crimes raised still linger. How does someone become capable of such acts? Could more lives have been saved if justice had acted sooner? These questions remain part of his dark legacy, serving as reminders that vigilance and accountability must never be taken for granted. Thank you for staying with me through this journey into one of history's most haunting true crime stories. If you found this video insightful, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries of the past and the cases that continue to shape our understanding of justice. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, history always has more stories to tell.